Well, I'm super excited to present our keynote speaker for this evening, who again is a great friend of us here in the Northeast. He's spoken at our events before and has come out to our walks and brought some family members that we've gotten to meet. But Dr. Fotios Koumpouras is Assistant Professor of Medicine, Training, Program Director, Rheumatology, and Director of the Yale Lupus Program. He is board certified in both internal medicine and rheumatology. He is an active member of the American College of Rheumatology, the Arthritis Foundation, and as I said, the Lupus Foundation of America. He's a native of New York City, a graduate of Stuyvesant School at 16 years of age. I did not know that before, Dr. Koumpouras. That's pretty impressive. He completed his college education at the State University of New York with honors in chemistry and biology, and was a member of the research team at the Wadsworth Center of New York State Department of Health, investigating cyclin E as a prognostic marker for breast cancer. He attended St. George's University School of Medicine and was elected to Iota Epsilon Alpha, the International Medical Honor Society, and graduated first in his class. Completed postgraduate training in internal medicine and was chief medical resident at Stony Brook University. He completed a clinical rheumatology fellowship program, as well as a program in investigative rheumatology at Yale University. He was awarded the Physician Scientist Development Award from the American College of Rheumatology and was a co-principal investigator for the ILAR project geared to improve access for rheumatological services in East Africa. And I am so excited to have his presentation today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Koumpouras.
Thank you so much, Sue and the LFA and Courtney at GSK for organizing this patient education event. And sorry, I was just trying to get myself back off mute and I couldn't find the button. But that's quite an introduction. And, but to give you a little bit about my lupus life. I came to understand science as a way to cure diseases when really I was in college, and that was when I got involved in archaebacteria. And these are particular bacteria that can bioremediate waste, and I was really interested in trying to bolster them so they wouldn't die so easily when they were exposed to heavy metals. And that heavy metal research led to a breast cancer laboratory where cyclin E, and by the way, cyclin inhibitors now are standard therapies for breast cancer, but this was 1993 or two. So with that scientific career, I entered medical school. And shortly after medical school, realized that immunology was my liking, went to Yale, studied lupus there, and then left Yale, went to Pittsburgh, and was the med director for the Lupus Center of Excellence with Sue Manzi. Learned all about clinical lupus and severe clinical lupus, how to manage it, and really learned the ins and outs of clinical research and clinical trials. And Dr. Manzi is a world leader on cardiovascular lupus outcomes. I was recruited back to Yale in 2015 to develop really and direct the clinical program for SLE and the clinical trial portfolio, which is what we've done over the last few years. And Jacinta, who's on the line, actually directs our wellness program, because in addition to the clinical program, we have a wellness program and a research program. The research program really is at this point devoted to clinical trials and really on discovering new drugs for SLE. Because it was very early on in my training that I realized patients who came in with lupus, we had very little options. In fact, if you looked at all the drugs available to other diseases in rheumatology, I felt really unequipped or ill-equipped to help my patients at the SLE. And in fact, I was repurposing drugs used for other diseases for patients with lupus with some varied success. And this has really led to the understanding that there's this huge unmet need for people with SLE. And it's really through clinical trials and clinical research that these new discoveries have occurred, right? And clinical trials have been going on for millennia. People have tried different kinds of topicals, botanicals, variety of things over thousands and thousands of years on their patients. Those are clinical trials. Maybe they weren't so well-informed clinical trials. And I think I'm going to show you today how much progress has been made in the realm of clinical research and clinical trials. I'm going to tie that into, of course, lupus, because lupus is really a perfect disease that requires additional research, and we're lacking in terms of that aspect. Okay, so I want to review some of the facts of lupus with you today. What really is a clinical trial? why trials are important in lupus, of course. And I'm going to use nephritis. Nephritis means inflammation of the kidney. I'm going to use kidney inflammation from lupus as a model for how new drug development occurred in SLE. We're going to talk about how you yourself and people who might have lupus or your friends or family who might want to increase their interest or participation in clinical trials. So participation, by the way, means just learning more about them. Doesn't mean they have to actually be a part of it on the day in and day out. And maybe I'll have a chance to introduce our lupus program and kind of what we've done over the last few years here. So I think many of you realize, and let me minimize, what's this? Perfect. Realize that, you know, lupus really occurs in two major forms. It's a chronic cutaneous disease or a non-systemic disease and a systemic illness. There's another small form called neonatal lupus, and that really is just a temporary form of SLE in children. But systemic lupus is disease that causes inflammation in multiple organ systems, but primarily in diseases that contain blood vessels, and that includes the joints, that includes the skin, and particularly the kidney. You know, because lupus disease can wax and wane, some of the symptoms are very variable. There can be short-lived, they can be long-lived, they can be mysterious, and actually lupus can be difficult to diagnose because it can be multi-system. For example, rheumatoid arthritis is always arthritis. This may be just kidney inflammation, you see. The other problem about lupus, another thing you should realize, is lupus affects young women, young females. And so these young females have a lifelong burden of disease if this is left undiagnosed or unmanaged. And it turns out that people of African ancestry or Hispanic ancestry actually are more affected, disproportionately affected, and more likely to have more serious outcomes of SLE. And it turns out, we're going to talk a little bit about how those exact groups actually have the healthcare disparity in addition to the health disparity that exists from lupus. The other reason that lupus may be difficult to diagnose is because it can mimic many other diseases, particularly infectious diseases. And actually, it's important to make sure that signs and symptoms of lupus actually are due to lupus and not another disorder. Okay. But as most of you know, lupus usually comes with joint pain, rash. It typically occurs at what we call the malar eminences, or at the cheekbones, in a shape that is reminiscent of a butterfly. Often patients get inflammation of the glistening surfaces. This includes the mouth, inside the eyes, and in other areas that you might imagine, including the colon, for example. And you can get ulcers. You can get mouth ulcers and vaginal ulcers. There's a particular sensitivity to UVB radiation. In fact, you can take skin cells from patients with lupus and you put them in a petri dish, and you take skin cells from patients who don't have lupus and you expose them to UVB radiation. It turns out the skin cells from lupus, the keratinocytes, undergo apoptosis, which is some kind of cell death, much more rapidly. They're much less able to handle UVB radiation for some reason. And so about 70% of patients can actually feel sick when coming from the sun. They don't need to have a rash, but they might have headache. They might want to vomit. They feel sick. Very common feature of lupus is fatigue, although it's not one of the criterion for SLE. But almost all my patients with SLE have fatigue is because their immune system is active, and unfortunately that causes a tiredness. They run out of energy. Lots of manifestations occur differently in different people, but importantly, those worse manifestations, and we need to realize this, the Hispanic and African American patients are more likely to develop worse lupus, kidney lupus, lupus that causes inflammation around the heart or lungs, hematologic lupus. And so we need to be particularly astute as to which groups might be more affected by severe disease so that we can screen, right? Doesn't mean everyone who is African-American comes in with nephritis, but of course, nephritis occurs more frequently in the first 5 years, and need to be more astute that those folks might get nephritis more frequently, and that if there are a few red cells in the urinalysis, you need to be vigilant. And so often the patient is their best advocate. I have some questions here to try to break the cadence. Questions. Black and Hispanic women also have increased disease symptom severity and experience more lupus-related complications compared to non-Hispanic white women. True or false? Let's see this. Can I see the audience somehow? How do you make this big? Oh boy. Screw it. Okay. All right. Wow.
I see
True. We just talked about it.
Mhm.
Yes. Yes. And so, in fact, African American and Black women, Hispanic women, women of South Eastern Asian descent, all have increased risk for developing lupus. Japanese, for example, Sri Lankans, each of these. So the character is true, and we need to, again, be aware of the imbalance in the risk. And in fact, lupus health disparity also occurs by race, and I mentioned this earlier, that African Americans in the United States have unequal access to healthcare. But if you're African American, you have lupus, the lupus is more severe for you, independent of your access to healthcare. And we know this by Sam Lim's work that looked at if you were either Black or white, and you looked at Fulton County, Georgia, census of patients with SLE, that at any time of SLE diagnosis, if you were Black, you had a much higher rate of death or likelihood of dying. The cumulative mortality was significantly increased. So this suggests, independent of access to healthcare, that the disease affects differently. And this is probably related to genetic differences. Increasing diversity of the study population in a clinical trial will negatively affect the findings of lupus clinical trials. True or false? We're going to increase the diversity. Is that good or bad? Of course it's good. The answer is false here, because it will not negatively affect the findings of a lupus clinical trial. Lupus affects a wide variety of patients from different racial and ethnic backgrounds, as I just mentioned, and actually increasing the diversity in clinical trials. Studying the panoply of symptoms and patients, the collection of, as we call, snowflakes, as each patient with lupus is unique, actually leads to better generalization of the data and better ability to apply the data to the public at large. And so the whole idea here is that to try to make these clinical trials much more diverse in terms of who they're representing. But why do we need clinical trials? Because if patients have lupus, how do you treat them? What's the mainstay here? Well, medications like anti-inflammatory drugs, as ibuprofen, naproxen, they help. But if you have kidney disease, you don't want to use that. And glucocorticoids were discovered in the early 50s, and they're remarkable at their ability to reducing inflammation. In fact, very few medications work as well as glucocorticoids. But we've learned quickly over the years that glucocorticoids are associated with significant damage accrual in patients with lupus and others, and there are side effects that really are intolerable. We also use drugs that were initially developed to combat malaria, but actually have significant immunomodulatory effects and anti-inflammatory effects, and are effective in patients with lupus. And this includes drugs like chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. We use immunosuppressants, and we're using immunosuppressants for patients who are having more severe symptoms or those folks who can't get off of it. And then over the last really 10 or 15 years, there's been the advent of biologic therapy. So these are medicines produced by biologic systems. So these are systems, these are cells that we are growing that release antibodies because we've taught them to release these particular kind of antibodies that we can concentrate and use therapeutically. That's a biologic. Whereas immunosuppressant now some biologics are immunosuppressants, or most of them. Immunosuppressant synthetic molecules, of course, made in a laboratory, in a chemical laboratory. But so we have a wide array of treatment, but only recently, as I said, have there been directed biologic therapy. Yet there's this significant unmet need for us. So what we're doing now is trying to understand how's the best way to treat people with lupus. What's the evidence? And these are the treatment recommendations published a few years ago, I think. And this is the European League Against Rheumatism. And the idea here is that if you're not a lupologist, if you're not seeing patients with lupus regularly, we have a way to help physicians understand how to treat patients with lupus. And I want to point out this side of this graph. Adjunctive here is sun protection. Because anytime you get significant damage to the skin, there's a release of those nuclear constituents, those proteins and or molecules inside the cells that many people with lupus have antibodies to. And when these cells break open, these molecules come out, your antibodies bind these molecules, and it causes inflammation. And so sun protection is really key to reduce that risk. Vaccines are really important because they will help prevent serious infection. And we're actually studying vaccines in lupus at Yale particularly COVID booster responses, and do they cause lupus flares? And what do the lupus immune cells do if we vaccinate them with the booster? Are they getting good antibody responses if they're treated with drugs like mycophenolate and rituximab? This is exactly the NIH study we're doing here at Yale to understand and unravel how lupus patients' vaccine responses actually truly differ compared to other patients who might be in mycophenolate, because you're comparing lupus to multiple sclerosis to rheumatoid arthritis. And controlling lipids, body weight, your sugar, all of these are very important. And of course, our target here on my right, probably your left, is this thing called SLEDAI, which means you really are feeling really well and we can't detect lupus anymore. And maybe you're only on the hydroxychloroquine when there's really no intensive therapy. Or maybe your score is really low, hard to detect, and you're really on minimal therapy doing well long-term. So these are our targets nowadays. Now, we'll just add to you that this was published in 2019. Right? That's not long ago. That's not even 36 months ago. Only now, 48 months ago, we're having recommendations on how to treat lupus. Okay. We knew very early that if you had kidney disease or something called lupus nephritis, and there are different subtypes, by the way, and they're called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We knew if you had the worst subtypes, 3 or 4, this was in the 50s and 60s. And by the way, most patients with lupus are in this subtype. We knew if you had these subtypes and you were giving steroids alone, that your survival was very low. Low. In fact, if you had type 3 nephritis at 6 months' time in the early 50s, your renal survival was 50%. And there was no dialysis yet. It was just being developed. So there was no renal replacement. So most patients died of kidney failure. Now, if you had another subtype called membranous, these people did fairly well with lupus, with glucocorticoids alone. But it turns out these are very few of the patients. And so I highlighted this triangle here because this is really the target and the unmet need, because this is the kind of disease that can affect the young person with lupus. And that's why there are clinical trials, right? So what is a clinical trial? Why do we have clinical trials? Well, a clinical trial tests promising treatments. Because if you went back and you looked at this, you're like, well, glucocorticoids isn't a promising treatment. If we use glucocorticoids only, we couldn't give promise to your kidney survival. So there was this way to test or wanted to look for new promising treatments. And that's really a definition for a clinical trial. And therapeutics really are studied in this way, although you can study different interventions, for example, fasting, avoiding gluten, all of that could be a clinical trial. And really clinical trials, they're really to study for their safety and to see if they're effective in the diseases that you're studying. So there are lots of reasons to conduct clinical trial. You want to evaluate if something works. You want to find new therapies, prevent things from happening, preventing strokes, for example. A low dose aspirin every day and someone, or regular aspirin every day and someone who's had a stroke was a clinical trial. We showed that if you did the aspirin versus not doing the aspirin, if you'd had a stroke, you did better if you kept on aspirin, right? That's a clinical trial. We also use clinical trials for evaluating different interventions, maybe at a diagnosis or understanding a different disease, examining new ways to understand risk factors, as I mentioned, in terms of stroke and aspirin use. If you're curious about a clinical trial, there's lots of questions to ask. First of all, you want to ask, what is being studied? What's being studied in this exact trial, and how is this different? Why do the researchers believe this intervention might be important? And actually, my patients ask me these questions, and usually I give them the information about what's the molecule, if this is a therapeutic trial, for example, why we're doing this, and what the previous data had showed. You should ask, what are the possible interventions you might get if you went into the trial? And how is it determined which interventions you get? And will you know if you get the intervention? Or how do they prevent you from knowing? And are there side effects from the interventions, and how those side effects might be different from each intervention? These might be questions to ask before you want to do a clinical trial. A simple one is, what do you have to do? Sometimes patients don't even know what to do. It's usually coming and just like coming to a medical appointment, except it's every And what tests or procedures are involved? Each of these are important because sometimes there are things done regularly in a clinical trial that aren't done in the appointment. For example, an EKG will be done for every 3 months in some instances. You may want to ask, how often do you have to come in this study? What type of long-term follow-up is part of this study? If you benefit, can you continue getting the study even if the study ends? Will you get the results? Will you know if you had the intervention or not? How long will the study last? Who pays for this participation? Do I have to go into the hospital? Who oversees my medical care? What happens if I'm injured? God forbid. All of these are really important questions, I think, to ask, and really good ones. And actually, the way your person you might be interacting with, actually the coordinator or the principal investigator, the way they answer these questions, I think will be a clue to you to see how well they can command the subject. There's a lot of emphasis on trying to find new and more effective therapies. I want to thank Kofi Mensah, one of our former fellows, who's now in research and development in Massachusetts, because he presented on clinical on preclinical development for drugs in our recent Yale Rheumatology rounds. But in fact, he shared data that shows that the research and development funding is increasing significantly over the last decade or so. You can get an idea of what this spike is happening. If you look at drugs for SLE, so really, the FDA approved hydroxychloroquine for lupus in 1955. Then it took almost 60 years for the next approval, belimumab. So, in terms of lupus, for example, you might have been on this part of the curve. And then suddenly over the last 10 years, there's been a significant increase in the clinical trial activity, particularly for lupus, especially for nephritis, knowing that it's a real serious issue for people with SLE. And in fact, there have been 3 new approvals and 2 new drugs over the last couple of years. And if you go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is a website that is an inventory of all the different clinical trials going on worldwide, although it is a voluntary reporting, but all of us do it. There are over 60, actually 50 is not really right, it's 60 recruiting active phase 2 or phase 3 trials for lupus. And at least in the US, most of these clinical trials, by the way, are occurring over about 15 or 20 different academic medical centers, Yale being one of them. Because lupus is not a very common disease. And so that the sites that are studying lupus are really mostly in the academic arena, which I think bodes well for study outcomes and for patients who may want to participate in clinical research. And so what are the phases of drug discovery and development? And really, this is the clinical trial aspect, a phase 1 trial, a phase 2 trial, a phase 3 trial. But, a lot of work goes into the preclinical development in drugs before they're even thought to be tried in first in human. So question. The Institutional Review Board must review, and this is a board at any academic center or any, you must interact with any IRB if you're doing any kind of clinical research. The IRB must review and approve all research trials involving human subjects. True or false? And the answer is true, of course. And that the IRB really is the regulatory arm, and they grant the authority after official review. And the IRB is made up of a board of independent scientific advisors, community volunteers, patient participants, and they all review it in an independent way. Any clinical trial that comes in, and they ask questions and they vote to see if this is something they want to move forward with before you can even carry out one of these trials in certainly at Yale. And in the old days, and this is the discovery of penicillin, and penicillin was discovered by Grams, and penicillin was serendipitous. It was a very rare mold, a different kind of bread mold that for whatever reason was growing in the lab, and it spilled over into a petri dish that was growing bacteria, and the mold product was found to be penicillin and would inhibit the bacterial cell wall eventually, and it became the first antibiotic. But now, really, we have a real structured design where we evaluate multiple compounds based on how compounds are formed, or the based on their structures and how they might fit into different enzymes, because we're able now to get a understanding of how molecules on cells look in a 3D space and how drugs might fit in those molecules. We don't know exactly, so we'll test 10,000 compounds in just a fit model, for example. And anything that might fit, they go further to see if they may be toxicity in other petri dish models and other kinds of assays. It usually brings us down to about 1 or 2 or 3 compounds that might actually go into humans, and that might lead to a safety profile, an efficacy profile, or an effectiveness profile that will lead to approval. So it takes a long time. So for those who may want to understand what phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 trials are, phase 1 really is to understand the safety of the drug, and we're doing phase 1. So we're studying already the drug has been tested in different laboratory systems, including other laboratory animals, and then comes into human volunteers, healthy human volunteers, at low doses to see how the drug works in terms of safety. They're usually a very small number. Those drugs that come through phase 1 are shown to have an acceptable safety profile, go into something called the phase 2A and then a phase 2B. And the phase 2B really is to gather, so the phase 1 knows that it's pretty safe and tolerable. And you'll see that phase 2 and phase 3 add additional safety, but there's no egregious or no serious safety concern if you get through a phase 1. And phase 2 is looking at to see if the drug works really, because it seemed to have worked in preclinical models. Now you're going to see if it works in people who have the disease, not healthy human volunteers. And that's a phase 2. And then in phase 2, you might try different doses. If you find the data at phase 2 that has a good safety profile and that the drug was effective, then you move on to a phase 3. And the phase 3 is a larger trial, gathering more information about how it works, how well it works, and how safe it is in many different populations. You have to have many more numbers across many different sites. And that the data, the information gained from a phase 3 trial usually leads to the FDA drug approval. Some companies like to continue to evaluate how the new medicine works after the approval, and that's called the phase 4 trial. And I'm going to share with you examples of some of these phase trials if we have time. Question. Clinical trials provide present and future benefits to the medical community, individual providers, individual patients, or all of the above. And the answer is really all of us. Clinical trials provide benefit to the wide group of individuals, including the medical community at large, patients who might benefit, new patients who might have the disease, and to actually, in many instances, discover new ways to treat diseases by information gained as part of clinical trial data. In fact, this happened in lupus nephritis. And a drug that we use in the transplant space called mycophenolate, or CellCept, was used as an alternative to azathioprine, which was standard of care, 2011, 10 years. Azathioprine, standard of care, and this and showed that CellCept, and this really, this is actually this is not even a phase trial. This is it's really a phase 4 independent investigator trial. Showed that mycophenolate was superior to azathioprine in the maintenance and keeping kidney lupus quiet. Okay, so we just got the data 10 years ago. Now, all of you are so familiar with mycophenolate, like it might be second nature, to say the least. But to understand that it was only through the clinical trials and going back and look at some of this data that we realized these drugs were working. In fact, if you go back and then extract further data about who are the folks in this trials and how do each of these different racial groups, for example, perform in the different aspects of the trial, leans more or lends more information about the disease and disease aspects. Here's a phase 4 trial. So Benlysta or belimumab was approved for lupus. And then GSK, the company that makes Benlysta, said, we want to see people who are getting Benlysta. We want to follow lupus patients who are getting it. We want to see what happens. Over time, this is a company extremely dedicated to the curing of this disease. And they've learned that if patients were given Benlysta and they stayed on Benlysta, that most of them, or many of them, eventually were feeling better. And 75% of patients were getting what was called a measurable response, an SRI-4 response. And so this phase 4 data, this phase 4 trial gave new data to show that, hey, look, we already got the FDA approval, everyone's using Benlysta, but if you stayed on the Benlysta, you did better long term. Questions: patients can withdraw from clinical trials at any time without an explanation. True. So if you're ever involved in a clinical trial and you want to withdraw for whatever reason or no reason, it's your right. I mean, we try to get your reason. We don't want you to withdraw. We often, if patients don't want to take the medication, we still like to follow them every month and see what's happening to their lupus, even if not getting medication, study drug. But you can certainly withdraw at any time from clinical trial without any reason or explanation. In fact, to go back to this belimumab trial, because this belimumab really has been the longest studied drug for lupus to date. Belimumab long term, and here's another kind of clinical trial. It's called a propensity scored match control. In any event, if you stayed on belimumab or you didn't, those who were on belimumab actually had less damage accrual and were doing better in terms of the amount of damage they had at 5 years' time. So the idea is that now we have the ability to prove that a drug modifies the course of the disease over time. Question: patients in the control group of a clinical trial will continue to receive current standard of care. The answer is true, of course. If you're in the control group, it's like you're seeing your doctor every time at the visit, except most clinical trials, you see them more frequently. And it's usually the doctor you're seeing in the clinic if that's the same person conducting the clinical trial. If you are in the control group, however, you're usually not aware of it. And usually, if let's say your lupus is flaring, or my patients are flaring, the researcher will treat your lupus. You know, it's not like we're going to withhold and watch you flare. Of course, we do what's right for the patient and safety. And often you stop the drug. And in this case, most patients in the control group stop the drug. They drop out because actually they're not on drug, and that works in favor of understanding if new medicines are working. And then the patients are treated appropriately as anyone would at a clinic visit. So it's not uncommon for folks to get a med-roll dose pack if the lupus is flaring, even if they're in a clinical trial, because they may be in the control arm. You got to treat the lupus because the doctors don't know. Another kind of trial, and again, I'm showing a lot of the Benlysta because it's been out there for the longest and has the most evidence, and it's actually grade A evidence through the EULAR criteria, through the EULAR data. But that they realized that if you were in the Benlysta trials, you actually had kidney lupus. It turned out your kidneys were doing better, and so they said, well, let's do a new trial and let's use Benlysta in people with lupus who have kidney lupus. And it turned out it worked in patients with kidney lupus. So they treated patients with a standard of care, which included mycophenolate, because I reminded you in 2011, we realized mycophenolate was superior standard for maintenance in lupus nephritis. And if you added belimumab to folks who were getting their mycophenolate for the lupus nephritis, it turned out almost 43% at 2 years' time, whereas half of them at 1 year's time were getting renal responses, these good renal responses. Normally, we're getting about a third of the patients. It's going to get loud in a second. Normally, we get about a third of the patients responding typically to current standard of therapy. So this is abysmal, right? Can you say, well, we know that you're going, there's a 35%, there's the 35% of the patients get to primary outcome with standard of care. That's the best we can do, right? That's the best, right? That's the best. I don't know how to mute this. Oh, well. Okay. And so, of course, there's this unmet need. Of course, we need better medicines. We need drugs that make people feel less sick, pills that are smaller, easier to swallow, less numerous, easier to take. So the primary role of the provider in referring a patient for a lupus clinical trial is to what? Determine the eligibility, make patients aware of availability of lupus-related clinical trials, contact the IRB to understand the benefits and risks of the medication being studied in the clinical trial, and provide patients with provisions for child support and transport? And the answer is the primary role of anyone who refers you for a clinical trial is to just make you become more familiar about clinical trial research and to provide awareness about the opportunities. That's all. Providers actually do not determine your eligibility for clinical trial. Actually, eligibility and referrals are two distinct aspects of the clinical trial process. We often will give provisions for child support. We are in contact with the IRB, of course, to understand risks and benefits. We don't move forward till we have the approval through the university to conduct the study. And this is a study we did conduct, and this was voclosporin, also marketed now as LUPKYNIS, which was approved for lupus nephritis, which showed that people who were getting standard of care and you added voclosporin compared to those who got standard of care, that 40% of patients on the voclosporin met their renal response. In fact, their kidney lupus went away. And if you kept them on the best of therapies without this experimental drugs, in this case, but now it's approved, only about 1 in 5 kidney lupus went away. Primary. So this is complete response. We got more people having partial response, but the goal here is, of course, to get the disease in remission. And in fact, if you treat 1 out of 5 patients with lupus nephritis with voclosporin, you're likely to get a complete renal response. And if you look at the probability to reach a good reduction in protein release from the urine, it was much faster in voclosporin. And so we were fortunate to be part of this trial, which led to the approval of a new drug for nephritis. A successful referral is measured by a patient's decision to enroll. True or false? That's false. The referral is the act of introducing the concept of a clinical trial to a patient as a quality treatment option. We talked about how in the best of hands, the complete renal response rate, the standard therapy is 35% in the best of hands. And so you see, the concept of the clinical trial is a quality treatment option for diseases that have significant unmet needs. In fact, patients are more likely to consider complete clinical trials and even participate in clinical trials if they have a high trust towards their provider, and this is true. And those provider-patient relationships are important. So I think if you feel like you don't know your doctor, maybe give them another chance or find another one. To help build trust with patients, what do we need to do? Well, we need to increase our cultural competency. We need to consider our implicit bias. We need to improve our communication strategy. We do all of these things. And doing these will help build the trust between our patients. Some of these, innately are tuned to these, but many people are not. This is something called the spider plot, and I really like this picture, but because it kind of looks like a spider web. But the idea here is that the further away from the center where the spider is, the better you are. And the other concept is LDAS is a low disease activity score for lupus. There should be LLDAS, lupus low disease activity score. And if you keep people on lupus low disease activity score, that means their SLEDAI score is 4, they're not on much prednisone, and their lupus hasn't flared in a while. And that's the goal, right? We should use medicines as using the LDAS as the goal, that people are more feeling better about their physical health. They experience less pain. They are much more likely to do executive planning. They feel better about intimate relationships. They feel much less a burden. Look at 50% of patients feel like they're a burden to others. They feel better about their emotional health. Body image is about the same. Their fatigue is better. So the idea is that we do want to get patients on low disease activity and keep them on that. And that this is our target now for folks with SLE. There are yet unmet needs, and these include the fatigue patients who have lupus who experience regularly. Fatigue is tough to treat. Depression, brain fog, headaches. All of these are kind of intangibles that we can't get better in many people, but we're trying. So in summary, lupus is a complex disease with unmet needs, and I hope I have convinced you of that there are significant health disparities in lupus and health care disparities in lupus. That only through clinical trial participation, clinical trial participation is a significant way that can help lead to new therapies in lupus. And I want to mention that Yale, in our program, is at the cutting edge of clinical trial management for lupus nephritis. And I personally was a biorepository chair for the Lupus Nexus. which is going to be a really fantastic resource for new lupus basic science research on lupus specimens, and that we are helping as a conglomerate to accelerate discovery for a cure. So with that, I want to thank, of course, my team, my mentors, Joe Kraft and Sue Kang, Zume Dong, who's part of my team, Jacinta, who runs our wellness program, Vai Chowdhury and Eugenia Chak, who are lupus clinicians, Sarika Ramachandran, who co-directs a rheum derm clinic with me. Ala does our gynecology for lupus patients and premature ovarian insufficiency. Randy Luciano is our key nephrologist. Alfred Lee is one of our key clotting hematologists. Daniel Glazier is a new addition to the pediatric arm of our lupus program, including Ian Ferguson, who has been part of the pediatric arm, and Julie Heffernan is our coordinator. I have a photo down here of me and one of my patients during the COVID pandemic, and I'm not sure you can really see it, but I'm wearing a really Superman mask, a superhero's mask that she had sewn for us, and that's over an N95. But we continued lupus research and clinical trial research through the pandemic, and we were one of the only few programs ongoing because it was in the middle of the trials. So of course I thank all of our patients, and I thank your attention, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
And that celebrity patient in that picture happens to be on the call with us today. I told her to keep looking, that she might get a glimpse of herself. So thank you so much, Dr. Koumpouras. Checking the chat box to see if we have any questions right now. I'm not seeing any. Alicia, are you seeing any right now?
No, none.
So I think what we'll do is we're going to head right into our patient panel, and that will be very interactive. So as we're moving forward with that, if you do have questions for Dr. Koumpouras, for Courtney, for any of the patient panelists, please put them in the chat box. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our patient panel today. Dr. Koumpouras did a fabulous job of mentioning Jacinta Rinaldi, nurse practitioner at Yale, who handles their wellness program. Again, a great friend to us here at the LFA, and we've worked closely with her for a number of years. And then we have three of our national ambassadors with us today. We have Jill Nelson. Jill, you want to give a wave? Jacinta, I probably should ask you to give a wave too. We have Brittany Wolf-Janaris, and we have Shira Kaplan. So I'm going to ask you guys all to unmute. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Jacinta.
Thank you so much, Sue. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's been great working with the Lupus Foundation. They've done so much for the lupus population that I've worked with since 2009, but really when I came to Yale is when I really dove into caring for people with lupus, and that was in 2015. So for the last 7 years, I've had the wonderful opportunity to work with you folks, and it's been amazing and inspiring, and I've learned so much. So thank you all. So with that said, I will ask each one of the panelists to just give a little 2-minute introduction about, kind of, when they were diagnosed and anything they kind of want to share with the group, initially. So I'll start with Shira Kaplan.
Okay, hi everybody. So a little bit about myself. I'm right now 46, turning 46, thank God. I was diagnosed at age 35. It took me approximately 2.5 years to diagnosis, and just about being dead when they finally, and landing up in the hospital when I was finally diagnosed. So for me, it's been, a lot of ups and downs. I'm grateful for my doctor and the care that I get at Columbia with Dr. Askenes. I can't ask for a greater doctor. I'm grateful for her saving my life several times over. I've been hospitalized several times. had an extreme effect on our family. And, you know, I had 3 young children at the time when I landed up in the hospital originally. You know, I could go more into my story if you can also hear me. I have a vocal cord injury from the original hospitalization from being intubated. Would you like me, Jacinta, to go into a little bit about my a little bit more into?
You know, why don't we give the other panelists maybe a sec to just quickly introduce themselves, and then we'll go around with some questions. But thank you so much for your introduction. So this is Brittany Wolf Generis. I think I'm saying that right.
Yep, I know I'm getting used to my new married name. A little bit about my background and my life with lupus. I am 28, almost 29 years old. I was diagnosed at 22 after having symptoms since I was 10 years old. So I went to a series, you know, a pediatric rheumatologist, and they really couldn't find anything. You know, I was seronegative at that point, but was having a tremendous amount of joint pain, inflammation, very swollen joints. And so we kind of overlooked it. You know, I was on a medication, but I was a child, so it was making me, you know, not myself. You know, I wasn't this cheery kid that I was really supposed to be. So I ended up, you know, playing volleyball my whole life, but in pain, you know, when I was younger and, you know, when I was a teenager. And then when I was end of my high school years, early college years, I actually had surgery, but came down with a septic staph infection, which almost killed me. And the infection kept rekindling. And soon after, when more symptoms were presenting aside from just joint pain, you know, rashes and tremendous amounts of fatigue, I ended up getting diagnosed with lupus. They think, you know, at the end of the day, it was all connected, and it happened to be a complication of it. So I now, actually, thanks to the Lupus Foundation, you know, I got involved pretty much right away with the LFA, and I have been, you know, at my first walk, I was connected to Dr. Saxena. He was speaking at the walk that day. So I was like, oh, who's that guy? So now I see him. He's been great because I've had ups and downs with lupus. You know, I feel like I manage it pretty well day to day. I try to keep a positive outlook. But over the last, since about the end of 2019, I have actually been on about 5 different medications because my lupus numbers have been spiking and nothing's really been working. So now we think we're on a good trajectory. So fingers crossed that everything works out well. But without his help and kind of that innovative thinking and trying new things, I mean, I probably wouldn't be where I am today.
Wow, that's great. I'm glad you're doing better.
Thank you.
Hi, it's Dr. Koumpouras. Just want to highlight Anka Askanas and Ahmet Saxena. Of course, we all know each other, as I mentioned, because there are just a few of us at these academic institutions that are centered on, you know, really improving and moving the needle in terms of lupus care. So it's so nice to hear, and all of us, you know, hopefully, as we exchange information, are just accelerating this.
Absolutely.
Cure.
You guys are doing a great job.
Great. Now, Jill Nelson, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, hi. I've had systemic lupus for about 3 years. I also had kind of a windy road to diagnosis. I had symptoms for quite a while, but I didn't get diagnosed until December of 2019. Similar kind of shocking diagnosis to hear. I'm a nurse practitioner, so I know a little bit about lupus, but, you know, I had kids and I was working and all those kind of really scary thoughts go through your head. How am I going to juggle all these balls? So being diagnosed with lupus was pretty life-changing for me. I had pericarditis, so I had to stop working. Really changed how I lived my life, changed my diet, changed how I went about my day. I had to take all kinds of rest periods, and I'm very sensitive to the sun, can't go in the sun, and even honestly, just to get enough sleep. I guess the positive that came about is I really learned to put my health first. I was, like I said, a busy mom, a very busy, stressed professional, and I just couldn't live my life like that anymore. So in a way, it taught me to slow down, take care of myself. And I think another really big lesson was learning to lean on the strengths of others around you. I learned how to say no. I learned how to rest and take care of myself, and let the people around me help me out. That was tough. Two more quick things. I've been involved in two different kind of more research clinical trials, not specifically drugs that I took, but data collection, lifestyle, and also one was blood drawing on certain time periods. As a medical person, I felt good about helping, so trying to help us figure out what was going on with lupus. And I guess the only other thing I really want to say is that I got diagnosed kind of just as COVID was really starting to kick in, and it was a really hard time because I didn't even see my rheumatologist in person for months. So I just want to make sure that anyone who's on the call tonight realizes that the LFA has incredible online resources. There's lots of other platforms and social media. And I would also really encourage people to talk to others in support groups. That was really helpful because you could meet up with someone that has lupus that really does understand how you live your life and the struggles that we kind of go through. But yeah, happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Jill. So Shira and Brittany, I know you, especially Brittany, you said you tried multiple different medications. In keeping with the theme of tonight's discussion, had they ever offered you like clinical trials, or did you guys ever think about it?
So I'm a little bit of a unique circumstance. So I also was diagnosed with ankylosing spondylitis in 2017. And so I do not qualify for many clinical trials, which has been a difficulty for me, given the fact that, you know, you can't have a comorbidity when you're enrolled in one. So especially if it's specific to lupus. So that's been my challenge, because even finding a medication is difficult because I can't take Benlysta, even if lupus wise I'm a candidate. But really it doesn't, you know, I have active ankylosing spondylitis. So, you know, to prevent any progression of my spine, I really need to be on some kind of JAK inhibitor, or I was on Cosentyx for a while. So right now I found actually kind of a decently good solution. I'm on Rinvoq right now, which is, I know, I suppose JAK inhibitors are early, they really early studies being studied in lupus. You know, trying that out a little bit in combination with my hydroxychloroquine. And I've also been on a number of immunosuppressants and things of that, and other biologics as well. So it's really been a lot of trial and error. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to qualify, but I just saw Dr. Saxena last week, and I was actually enrolled in the NYU sample registry and biorepository study. So more of an observational study where it's just over time, they take samples that my doctor might take from me on a routine basis, and then study them, and also study them in parallel to what symptoms I'm experiencing, to really see, you know, really try to accelerate that precision medicine approach to drug development, seeing if there's any biomarkers that are in my blood or any other sample I might have to give at some point in time, to see if there is a kind of a trend between my symptoms and my flares, if there are any, and what is in my you know, in my blood or urine or what have you. So I'm glad I'm able to participate, because I work in a pharmaceutical company in a global scientific communications role. So clinical trials are close to my heart professionally, and I think they're a huge benefit. I think if you can, everyone should participate as long as it's right for you. It's really just a matter of educating yourself on it and making sure, you know, asking the right questions. And Dr. K really highlighted those perfectly. You know, making sure that you're educated, you know what you're getting yourself into, and you just have that open dialogue of communication with your doctor.
Great. Yeah, definitely. How about you, Shira? Any trial talk in your past?
Yes. So I think not long, I think once things were more under control after like a year, so I was diagnosed in 2013. So it took time to really get things under control, and then, just getting into what normal is at that point. I do remember there were, I was asked to participate, let's say, in just research, in terms of people just taking my blood and so forth. That was at the beginning. And then I was asked if I wanted to participate in the trial of a colleague of my doctor's. And so I got to it through my doctor. And, I think, and I think a lot of people mentioned on here, it's really about the support that you have around you, your whole team, my doctor, my family, everyone, in terms of the support that I have really makes a difference in every part of your care. So getting to participate in the clinical trial, it's so funny because what I know now after being part of, the lupus community for so long at this point, I know so much more about clinical trials than I did when I agreed to participate in the clinical trial. So I wish I would have known all I know now, just because it would have made me more informed. I would have felt even more empowered. And even known all the different roles of who everybody was in the trial, and also know, it's just really the being empowered and feeling like you're really part of the team. And, I see in terms of just, in terms of my regular care, the more I know, I'm also, you get the more, let me backtrack. It's important to have those connections. So also participating in these clinical trials, you're also meeting more doctors, you're meeting more people who are involved in your care. You hear different things. While I was there participating in that clinical trial, I saw a sign for a different clinical trial that actually interested me in terms of cognitive impairment, which, as you see, can affect me when I'm trying to remember what I want to say. So I saw that. And so there's just a lot of resources. Also, the more people you meet who are involved in the lupus community, the doctors, the nurses, it only helps make my care better and gives me more optimism about the future. And not only it's helping myself, but also helping the larger community.
That's great.
Yeah. So in terms of the clinical trial, the main thing I recommend is really learn about how clinical trials work. And so then when you're presented, you'll know if it's the right thing for you or not, for that specific trial or not.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And I think it is empowering because you are, you're learning more about the disease. I think when you're in a clinical trial, you're being watched, really, really closely. So I think, I think for some people it is great. It is a great option. I know before you two of you guys had mentioned Jill and Shira that you had, small children at the time that you were diagnosed. Did you share with them, your diagnosis right away, or how did your kids handle it?
So I have a couple levels to that. My children weren't young. They were in high school. And I couldn't really hide it because I got pericarditis and I couldn't breathe. I couldn't walk. I couldn't even walking to the kitchen to cook food for myself. I couldn't do that. And you have to realize, you being a nurse practitioner, that's what I was doing. I was, 16 hours a day, never sitting, running around, doing everything for everybody. And I have a rather large extended family that I was helping out due to a death in the family. So I I couldn't hide it. I try very hard to still hide it. I don't really have a good answer for that. I guess that's just me being mom and not wanting to upset my children or them to have to worry about me being sick. But and then again, you had to add the whole COVID thing that, my family, basically, I lived in a bubble for 2 years. I mean, I hadn't done anything, honestly, much till this year, and I ended up getting COVID, and I was sick from that. So it's been a tricky evolution in our family of understanding chronic illness, and it's I can't speak for the other people, especially being a mom, but you just want to protect your children from worrying about you. I think that's still there.
For sure. Anybody else have any?
So you were asking about in terms of other people knowing about it. So for me, as I was saying, I landed up in the hospital, and I landed up being there for a little over 3 weeks, and then had to go to rehab and learn how to do everything again. So for me, it was sent out to the whole world, asking everyone for prayers. So, and I come from a family also that advocacy is very important, and even participating in clinical trials also was something that my father participated in a clinical trial. And so, I sometimes walk around my community, and different people, one specific person stops me, and he's like, he thinks I'm a walking miracle, when he sees me, and so I actually get, that makes me happy, and then getting involved with the LFA, and I think it started in 2015 or 16, not sure. I just saw an ad pop up on Facebook. So now I'll talk about lupus till kingdom come with anybody who will listen. And I appreciate being part of the community and having that support that we get from one another. And any other part to that question about how to affect my kids? My kids were little. My son, by the time I saw my 2.5-year-old again, after I was in the hospital, he was talking so much more, and also when you're in the hospital, my 2 daughters came to visit me, but they saw me once and they didn't want to come back. That was scary for them. But they each had supportive teachers. My second daughter actually sometimes takes out a book that her teacher wrote with her about the story of when my Ima got sick and got better. And it was just well done. That teacher's still in touch with us to this day. But it's very hard on them. It's very hard on them still in terms of, my needing to rest, the impact on the family. And, even now, why are you tired all the time? Why do you all day? What do you need to, you know what I mean? But that's now dealing with teenagers. So that's a whole different thing at this point. But it's taken its impact, and I find strength from the advocating and participation, feeling that I'm part of my cure. Do you know what I mean? That's it.
Yeah.
So we're coming up on 7 o'clock, which I know we said was going to be the end. I think we could continue this conversation for a long time. I think there's been great information. In the chat box, Alicia has posted some information about how to find clinical trials, questions to ask. I thought Dr. Koumpouras' presentation was excellent, and being your best advocate and asking those questions. I think there's a lot of misinformation, and I think that's something we could have spent a lot of time talking about. A lot of people think you have to go off your background meds. A lot of people think you have to get blood draws every time. Every trial is different. So I think really learning and understanding is so important. But I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank Jacinta. I want to thank Dr. Koumpouras. I want to thank Courtney and us in Lupus GSK and all of you for being with us. We will have additional programs coming up in the next few months, so keep on the lookout for those. And I wish everybody a great evening. Thank you so much.